Hey guys, what's up? It's Ozu, and today we're going to be analyzing Game 3 of the Women's World Chess Championship, which is happening currently in Shanghai between Ju Wenjun and Tan Zhongyi. I thought it'd be funny to analyze myself because I'm 1800 around, and I know there's many Grandmasters, International Masters that do a game analysis, but I thought it would be funny for a low-rated player to analyze and maybe give, like the perspective of a low-rated player and how they analyze the position. Maybe something's gonna be interesting. So the game started with e4 c5. This is generally a Sicilian defense, but it quickly went typical move. This is completely normal, but d4 is an option later. Usually the knight gets developed to c6 for black, and then there's takes. You take, but you would not take the knight on c6. But here they played a sideline, which is Ju Wenjun played a sideline, which is c4, I believe, and after the typical knight c6, which is a typical developing move in the Sicilian, there was d4, which is top engine move, but it aims to control the center, and you have like a strong 3 pawns in the center. Typical how you have it in the Austrian attack, where you have the knight on f6, black has a knight on 6, a pawn on g6, and then I think it's on d6, black has also a pawn, and what white has is a very confident center, but black is going to play on the sides. So after cd, knight takes, bishop check with the developing move, knight blocks is the best. I mean, this is possible, but you don't really want to trade off your dark sword bishop that early to double the pawns. Everything developing. d5 is typical move, you want to develop in the center. Maybe your bishop wants to go to d7. And after takes, well, these pawns are strange without having the d pawn. So takes. And now we can already see something interesting. So black already has a isolated queen pawn on d5, and white doesn't have an isolated pawn. So usually white would be a little bit better, as the engine suggests here, because this isolated queen pawn, yes, it can promote, like it's on a semi-open file, but it's easy to attack. You could imagine the knight was on e3, the knight blocking. You have potentially, in a world where the queen could end up on a5 or on b3, you could attack the isolated queen's pawn. So usually you wouldn't want to have isolated queen's pawn. Exchanging the knight. Okay, now it's no longer isolated. The a7 pawn's isolated, maybe a potential weakness. So far I would for sure prefer white, because I feel like this bishop can always trade, getting the queen more active. Okay, it can be countered by castling. I mean, if I show, that's even better for black now because of the taking, but we imagined that the taking wasn't there. Right, we continue from where? Castles, typical developing moves. And there we go, the isolated pawn is created. Yes, it can be reinforced very thoroughly with bishop e6. The knight is protecting, the queen is protecting, we can also have the rook that is protecting, but it's still an isolated queen's pawn. So, take it or leave it, it's still going to be a weakness and a target. There we go. Typical move, just, targeting the isolated queen's pawn. You now have 1, 2, 3 attackers for 2 defenders. I don't know why I held to the pawn. Tan Zhongyi defends the pawn. Everything normal. And also develops, maybe the rooks can go here when trading. The rook is going to be on an open file. I don't know, let's put an example of this. And I guess you have an open file of the rook. Maybe queen a5 might come at one point. Queen a5 looks pretty decent. Attacking, and here it's probably mostly balanced. I would even say it might be easier to play with black, but okay, never mind. Let's see what actually happened. The bishop took. This is a move to damage the structure, I believe. Do we have a bishop here? Did I skip a few? Okay, bishop came out to develop, and we have a damaging of structure. So this move is done to also create an isolated pawn. So now you have here, before, Black had 3 pawn islands. What pawn islands are like clusters of pawns. So you have one pawn island here, and one big one here. And usually the more pawn islands you have, the weaker your position is, because you have more isolated pawns. So imagine you had a pawn on a6, a7, c7, e7, and g7. That would not be good, because all your pawns would be weak. They wouldn't be able to support each other, because pawns are usually strongest when they are the strongest pawns are when they're defended passed pawns. So okay, passed pawns makes sense, but when they're defended means that they can help each other out. So this is why you always want to have like pawn chains and not isolated pawns. So Tan Zhongyi creates a isolated pawn, a c pawn for Ju Wenjun, and I mean, in a perfect world, the c pawn for white and the d pawn for black, they would disappear. The a2 pawn for white and the a7 pawn for black would disappear, and we would get an easy draw. Because 3-on-3, it doesn't even matter that you have the bishop pair here and bishop and knight here. 3-on-3 is a draw. So Tan Zhongyi attacks the pawn. Queen a4 also attacks the pawn, and white really wants that black takes. Yes, engine is still like, okay, this is completely drawn, but your queen is more active. You have a bishop here, and you have a pawn that is more dangerous than this pawn. This pawn can easily be stopped, or relatively easily. This pawn is more difficult to stop. But let's go back to analysis. h6 kicks out. You'd never want to trade a bishop for a knight in this position. The board is mostly open, and if you trade the bishop for the knight, it's just drawn. It's dead, the game. Or, well, okay, even black is now better because of the pawn here. So rook develops, everything normal. Queen slides out. So far, all developing moves, attacks the rook. Now this is piece improvements. Slow, because everybody understands this game is going to last for a while. We are on move 18 and it lasts until move 87. Maybe I spoiled a bit, but everyone knows you have to develop slowly. There's not going to be a knockout punch. So developing, offering a queen trade. Now you don't accept the queen trade because, again, that's basically a draw offer. If you want for Ju Wenjun is in the worst position. Like, I mean, she's 1.5, 2.5, so she needs to win. She's playing with the white pieces. So if you trade the queens over here, it's basically drawn, or even a slight edge for black. No, it's completely drawn. 0-0 on all 3 lines means that there's little hope. But with this maneuver, they trade the pawns, as expected. I predicted before that these 2 pawns are going to go, so they did. Attacking the queen. Taking is again worse. You don't want to take, because this pawn is better. Because you might get something like this and push. Yeah, well, pushing is second best, but even here, reinforcing the rook. Here we can imagine, and this is better. The bishop is more active, the bishop here, and this pawn is walking up. Yes, this pawn is annoying, but in the long term, the b4 pawn is faster. Maneuvering pieces, sorry. And here looking at trade off a pair of rooks. It's always good if you feel like you have an advantage, or if you're in an endgame, to trade off one pair of rooks. Because the rooks can really be sometimes annoying. If I make some moves, we can imagine. If we don't look at the evil bar. This is quite annoying for white to deal with, because the rooks here are strong. Okay, you have a rook e2, or in this case, queen takes b6. You can take the queen, but okay, say this move wasn't available. Like say it was this. The knight could take, yeah. Okay, we'll say this move wasn't available. The rooks on the 2nd or on the 7th ranks, they're really strong. So exchanges rooks, opening a loft, basically to avoid any back rank problems. So now this rook is free to move because we don't want the game to end like this. Okay, there is the bishop defending, but say, yeah, like this. Again, maneuvering, attacking the rook, attacking the queen, attacking the rook. So this is also nice. This was also a nice maneuver here. Attack the rook once, attack the rook twice, attack the rook 3 times. So the rook has to play really passive here now. So the rook is now passive. Ju Wenjun activates her rook. This is given a brilliancy because you can't take your own bishop's hanging, and with that you have a bunch of threats on g2, g3. If I just show what happens if you take, bishop takes b5, and because of the weaknesses on g2 and h3, black is actually better for, I believe it's the first time in the game. So h4 to kick out the queen. Queens get traded. And we get it into an opposite color bishop endgame. Now, usually, the game would end right here. It would be a draw because you have a 3-on-3. But because you have the c3 pawn, you can continue playing and trying. You know, this pawn, you have one more pawn, it's a passed pawn, anything can happen. So there's going to be a bunch of maneuvering. And what Ju Wenjun does really brilliantly is she activates her king. So, I mean, this is what I struggle a lot with the games too. You know, you think, okay, I'm going to improve this, I'm going to improve this, I'm going to give some weird checks, I'm going to put my pawns on the right, put my pawns on the, like, on the squares, whatever, on some squares. But here you have to realize that, okay, the only way to win this position is by moving your king to g8, maybe f6, maybe f8, basically more active, and putting your pawns on the correct color complex. Because if all your pawns are on light squares, then they can become targets and they can be picked off. But if you put all your pawns correctly on the dark squares, then there's no way for black to generate any counterplay. Basically, white is the only person now calling the shots. So that's exactly what is done. All the pawns are on dark squares. The king is more active. If we look again on the last, move 1, move 2, move 3, and move 4. Everything done brilliantly. King moves back. And now this pawn is going to start working. Well, first the king and a bit of shuffling, because it's really difficult to make progress. You have to time the push correctly. And now we push. 1, 2. You always want the pawn to end up on a dark square. So if you can push it once, you have to push it twice too. Because if it gets blockaded on a light square, then the game has a draw. Well, it's going to get picked off, and 3-on-3 is a draw. Rooks, no rooks, bishop, no bishops, it's still a draw. And of course, engine now is giving 0.5. But in reality, when the players are playing, it's a draw. So pawn gets pushed. And this is the only mistake. I mean, the mistake is so subtle. It's almost unnoticeable. You know, blockading the pawn, everything seems correct. And the only move now is king g5. I was watching the commentary, and it was a choice. Of course, you want to get your king more active, because this is what you need to do. As I mentioned before, you have to get your king on g7, f6, or f8. Well, eventually. There's two choices, e5 or g5. And the difference between, if you go to e5, it's a draw because of rook a4. But if you go to g5, if you have rook a4, you have the check. And then, okay, let's say they play king d7, and you can slide the rook back. And if you attack, you can either give a check, or I guess even defending the pawn is fine too. Yeah, I thought defending the pawn, but yeah, that's fine too. So it's crazy subtle difference, but it makes the game. And now there's more shuffling. Notice how the rook got in. The king is more active now. The bishop is kicked out, and it's the crazy thing is, before we looked, the only threat was the c5 pawn, but now there's also checkmating threat. So f3, f4 is checkmate, or in a world. Sorry, f3, bishop f4. Yeah, because now the king cannot go anywhere. Well, okay, there is this square, but if we play f3, then this square is taken. So the king gets more active, and it's slow, like it's squeezing the juice from the lemon. Black attempts to create some counterplay. Ju Wenjun deals with it, and now the pawn is one square away from pushing. And here the white got in a bit of time trouble, because you have to calculate everything. It's not an easy endgame, and there was a few moves. Oh yeah, this is a cool. So again, attempting to, you know, maybe it's a bluff. You know, you take and somehow black can get in, take the pawns, and save everything. But this check is nice. It's to push the king further away. Take. And this is a beautiful brilliancy to end the game. So you play this. If you take the bishop here is the only piece protecting the square. So you take it. Black has to take, and you can queen. And if you don't take, there is no way that black can stop the pawn. They can try. There's h7. Rook Rook h1. And well, I guess there's even this. You can even sacrifice the rook and queen. And at this point, it's over. You know, you can queen again, and it's game over. So this is how the game ended. And now the match is even, and tomorrow is round 4.